to the Stockbridge Munsee, not the last of the Mohicans, with Heather Bruegl. And I want to welcome you. It's one of our local history speaker series at the Hudson Area Library. Our history room mission is to acquire and preserve the holdings regarding the history and culture of the library's service area, which is Hudson, Greenport, and Stockport in New York State. It's an area in upstate New York. It's a river town for those of you that are new to the library. And we also work very hard to provide access to these holdings. So please do check out our website at HudsonAreaLibrary.org. Other programs from our history room include, we have a history room on Zoom series where local experts are interviewed about various topics in local history, and these are available on the library's YouTube channel. And in addition to that, another program, we have individual local history research that are done by research volunteers, some of whom are on the Zoom tonight. So you can go online to HudsonAreaLibrary.org and fill out a research request. This is free, it's no cost to you, and we will do research on the history of the local area. And we also have annual history room exhibitions in the library's community center. Our last one was about the history of the census in Hudson. And we have upcoming an online oral history collection that will be dropping in the next months. So we're very excited about that. We got a federal grant to work on that, and it includes an oral history of the Black community in Hudson. And I just want you to know that if you enjoyed tonight and would like to make a donation, you can send a check to Hudson Area Library. If you write history room in the memo part of the check, it will go directly to the history room. There's also a donate button on our history room page on the library website. So feel free to do that. And the donations are used for programs like this, for archiving, for preserving and acquiring holdings about the history of Hudson and Hudson area. Now I'd like to show you a couple of things very quickly before Heather speaks. Our library director, Emily Shamidas, has been collecting even more books on Native peoples that include the Stockbridge Mohican Indians. So those of you that are in our library system, anywhere in the Mid-Hudson system, the Stockbridge Mohican Indians, Jonathan Edwards and the Stockbridge Mohican Indians is one. The Mohican Indians of Stockbridge by Patrick Frazier. To Live Upon Hope, Mohicans and Missionaries in the 18th Century Northwest. There's a lot of, you can't see this because of the shine, but there's a lot of new books that we've acquired, and they're recommended by the community that Heather represents. Red Brethren, this is also involving directly the Stockbridge Indians. And this is about Mohicans. It's by Shirley W. Dunn, a well-known author, The River Indians. So those are very particular to the talk tonight. As a former school librarian, I will tell you there is nothing in the world like YA, young adult literature. And this is on Native peoples. If I ever get out of here, by Eric Gansworth. Heart Unbroken by Cynthia Leitich Smith. And hashtag Not Your Princess, Voices of Native American Women. That sounds like a really good book. So there's lots more that I could show you. What I will do is send the list of these resources and other resources that we have through our online resources, and some links from social media that Emily will be putting up. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Emily, about our books or anything?
The only thing in addition to that is while we're not open for browsing of newspapers right now, we do get the Mohican News from the Stockbridge Munsee Community. So when we are able to share our newspapers again for browsing, you can come and read that. We get that every week.
I'm so glad I asked. Okay, so tonight we will learn the history of the Stockbridge Munsee Community, a society of Indigenous families and European immigrants. And we'll also learn about the people who inhabited the land that makes up New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And Heather is speaking from the Cultural Affairs Department of the Stockbridge Munsee Community, and their mission is to protect, preserve, and tell the history of the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. They do this through the archives at the Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum. And so now Heather Bruegl, she's the Director of Community Affairs for the Stockbridge Munsee Community, and she's a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and she'll be speaking on this vibrant community. Oh, and I should just tell you one more thing. Any questions that you have throughout the lecture, if you can put them in the chat, and I will send you emails with the list of books. Somebody already asked me about that. It's kind of hard to put them all in the chat while I'm, working the program tonight, but I will send that as an email. So if you have questions, we do have a question and answer period, and that would go to the chat. So Heather, welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm super excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about the Stockbridge Munsee community tonight. I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting on the reservation right now. That was part of the 1856 treaty. And that's, we'll talk a little bit about that, throughout the talk. And also like to acknowledge that probably where you're sitting in your homes or wherever, you are on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge Munsee community. So just wanted to make that acknowledgement and know that, we're hoping to create an inclusive and equitable space for all people. That's our mission. And so I'm really excited to be doing this tonight. I'm going to talk to you about the Stockbridge Munsee community, a brief history. I could talk for hours about it, but I'm going to just give you some highlights, and then hoping for a really robust question and answer session afterwards. That's my favorite part, actually, of any presentation that I do is the after part. It's the question and answer part, because people ask the most amazing questions, and so I really look forward to that part. So let's just get started here. So the Stockbridge Munsee community, not west of the Mohicans, as James Fenimore Cooper so famously, made that phrase famous. We are not the last of the Mohicans. We are still here. And I would just like to point out that the picture on the front here sits at our main road into the reservation. And so that's really just cool to acknowledge, that we're the Mohican Nation. So I like that. So who are the Stockbridge Munsee? We are the Mohican people, peoples of the waters that are never still. We settled along the Mohican-Munsee, which you know as the Hudson River, and that is the river that flows both ways. Water is very important to us. Obviously, we are the people of the waters that are never still, and on our current reservation, we have the beautiful Red River that flows right through it. And so the Mohican-Munsee plays a huge role in our history. We were in the lower parts of it, and the Haudenosaunee were towards the north, along with the Mohawk, and but that's who we are. We are the Mohican-Munsee people, the Mohican people. So what was our territory? So we encompass 6 states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. That seems like a lot, but it's a lot because we also have the Munsee people in our ancestry as well. And the Munsee are the Delaware or the Lenape, who joined us later on, and then we became the Stockbridge Munsee people. And so our ancestral homelands are, like I said, 6 states: southwest of Vermont, the entire Hudson River Valley of New York from Lake Champlain to Manhattan, western Massachusetts up to the Connecticut River Valley, northwest Connecticut, and portions of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And just to think about how extensive our land goes, Philadelphia sits on Lenape land, and so that would encompass parts of our territory as well. So again, the Mohican people were mainly in the Mohican-Munsee River Valley, Hudson River Valley, but because we have that Munsee with us as well, it takes up part of that as well. As Mohican people, we never forgot that there were many of our relatives of other tribes who traveled with us over the centuries. Our Mohican leaders often sent warriors to assist their allies when they were in danger of being attacked. But these were temporary alliances and did not result in powerful confederacies such as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy, and that's made up of the Six Nations. And this map is just a map of our territories. So we have the great distinction of having encounters with certain explorers such as Henry Hudson. We like to say that we discovered him off of our shores instead of him discovering us, because we didn't need to be discovered. We knew where we were. And so in September of 1609, Henry Hudson sailed up the Mahicanatak and came into contact with us. The area that he found himself in was rich with beavers and otters and the furs that the Dutch coveted the most. These were money makers. And so by 1614, there was a Dutch trading post that was set up on Castle Island. And as a result, the fur trade expanded and furs became more difficult to find, because if you're constantly hunting something, you're going to hunt it into non-existence. It's going to be harder to come across. And so there were tensions that built up between the Mohicans and the Mohawks, and also tensions that were building up between the Dutch and the French and the English, because this was a huge like kind of gathering pot of different colonist groups coming in. So you had the French, the English, and the Dutch all coming into one area. New York was first New Amsterdam, so it was set up as a Dutch colony, and so you have that part in there. So the native people were caught up in wars between the Dutch, the French, and the English, and the Mohicans were eventually driven from their territory in west of the Mahicanatak. And in the early 1700s, there were questionable land purchases and cultural conflicts, and it forced them to move further east near the Housatonic in what would become Massachusetts and Connecticut. So as the English replaced the Dutch in the area, movement is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. So again, like I said, in the early 1700s, the Mohicans moved further west near the Housatonic River in what is today Massachusetts and Connecticut. The English were set on making the native nations civilized, so to speak. I use that term loosely because, like, who defines civilized for me? Economic way of life for the Mohicans was changed with contact with the Europeans. Traditional items were no longer being made, and new items such as iron kettles, cloth, guns, and colorful glass beads were available. So we kind of changed what we were doing. So instead of doing like traditional items, we had the introduction of beads. So beautiful beadwork was coming about. The glass beads allowed us to do that. Cloth allowed us to make clothing instead of using animal hides. We were using cloth now, and so it was interesting. And so that part is part of the civilization process. Another part of the civilization process is the use of boundary lines and fences. Boundary lines and fences were put up, and when land was shared with non-native people. So if you had settlers coming in and encroaching on the territory that the native nations were in, fences were put up so you couldn't go across. And one of the most famous, I would say, is if you're ever in New York and you're walking down Wall Street, there's a reason it's called Wall Street. There was a wall that was put up by the Dutch, actually, to keep the Lenape out. And so it's just not, the financial capital of the world. It is an actual wall that was there. It was a barrier. And if you know anything about Native nations, boundary lines as we know them today are really non-existent. There is not something that we did. And then also there was the arrival of disease, and that was inevitable. You have people coming in from a foreign land, and disease is just going to end up being part of something that you deal with. And one of the major things that was dealt with was smallpox. And smallpox hit Native nations hard. All diseases hit Native nations hard, but smallpox hit particularly hard. There was no immunity. We weren't exposed to these diseases beforehand, and so they were coming in, and it was just decimating Native tribes altogether. I didn't realize my phone was going to start ringing. Sorry about that. And so the numbers of people just started to drop and dwindle. So as settlers arrived, the Mohicans became more dependent on the settlers in order to survive. And so that is something that can be talked about throughout Native history in general, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But we also have the introduction of missionaries. The arrival of missionaries, they entered Native villages in order to convert the Native people to Christianity. Native people agreed to be Christianized after seeing the prosperity of the settlers. So there was this mindset of, they saw the settlers, the colonists doing really well. And so they figured, hey, if we convert to Christianity, that's going to happen for us too. Not always the case. And we were Christianized extremely early on. Again, we were on the East Coast of what would become the United States. So we encountered a lot of people, and a lot of that was also happening to the south of us too. If you think about the colonies in Jamestown and along the Carolinas, those tribes that were there as well, the Seminole down in Florida, were also had early contact and were Christianized also early on. In 1734, a missionary by the name of John Sargent came to the Mohicans in the village of Watucut, which he preached and baptized many Mohicans. And one of the things that he also tried to do too is learn the language of the Mohicans. And so we find today, and that we actually have them here in our archives, a lot of catechisms that were rewritten in the Mohican language, because it's easy to convert people if you can have it written in their language. So he preached and he baptized, and he had a large following of Mohican people. In 1738, the Mohicans gave him permission to start a mission. So an actual mission house was built. And that mission house is still standing, and it's in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The more Europeans moved into the area, and after they moved into the area, that's when that Mohican settlement was then renamed Stockbridge after a place in England that was close to them. Others who wished to hear the mission's teachings also came. So other Native groups came to the area and also to convert to Christianity as well. And this included the Wappingers, the Brothertons, the Tuxas, the Pequot, the Mohawks, the Narragansetts, and the Oneidas. And they merged with the Mohicans, and they were called the Stockbridge Indians. And so I always found that really, really interesting, and that's how we got our name Stockbridge. Some of these more came and stayed with them and traveled with them throughout. And so that's how we got that name. And it's also important to point out too that places like Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where these missions were set up, were also known as praying towns, which is a precursor to the reservation system that's going to later pop up in U.S. history. We're not going to talk about reservation system too much tonight, other than to talk about our reservation here. But the praying towns were the precursor to the actual reservation system that would be set up later on. So wars. War is inevitable, and we know that there were a lot of wars that happened at the early colonization of the country, and then later on to form the country. So between 1700 and 1800, European countries battled for what was going to be called the United States eventually. And it affected the Stockbridge in a lot of different ways. The French and Indian Wars were really conflicts between England and France over territory that they had taken from the native people. So that's really something to think on. The French and Indian War was really a conflict between two outside forces discussing what was going to happen with the land that they took from the native people who were there. The Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 were fought between American colonists and England. The Americanized colonies no longer wanted to be governed by the mother country. And the War of 1812, as a historian, is something that I dub the Second American Revolution. And I think that's really interesting to talk about because it happened so fast. The Stockbridge Mohicans, as well as the Oneida, Tuscarora, and other native warriors, supported the colonists in their battle. And one of the major battles was the Battle of Van Cortlandt, and that's the photo on the screen is actually a memorial to talk about the Battle of Van Cortlandt, where a number of Stockbridge Mohicans lost their lives during that. And that memorial is actually located in Brooklyn, and there were, it was the Stockbridge militia that was actually formed that contained Stockbridge Indians who went and fought on the side of the colonists. So I think it's also important to talk about that. You know, we fought on the side of the colonists because that does come up later in our history. So you have the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. After the war, after the American Revolution in particular, a lot of the Stockbridge returned to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and found that their lands had been lost and that they were being forced from the area. And that happened a lot. Native nations would go off, fight for the colonists, and come back and find that they were being forced from the area. And after leaving Stockbridge, they moved to New Stockbridge near Oneida Lake in upstate New York. The tribe flourished while they were there. However, things were going to change again. And this is a pattern that we end up seeing. We get to an area, we do really well, and then we're forced to move again. So it's hard because it causes a breakdown of it caused a breakdown of the traditional Mohican way of life and beliefs. There was some practice of, ceremonies in secret that would happen, but all of the moves, you don't think that they take a toll, but they end up taking a toll because you're being forced to leave what you know and what you love and what you've been able to be part of. And so this map on here, it's the Stockbridge Mohicans Trail of Tears. When you think of Trail of Tears, I know a lot of people think of the Trail of Tears that the Cherokee encountered in the Southeast during the 1830s removal, but removal started way before that in the Northeast part of the United States. It was something that we had to deal with for a long time. And so after we left Oneida Lake in New York, we traveled to White River, Indiana. And there we were going to live among the Miami and the Delaware. And the Delaware were the Lenape. When we arrived, though, after a year of traveling by foot, we discovered that the Delaware had been coerced into selling their land. So we had no place to go. We had no place to stay. So back in New York, because of course with every move people do stay behind. Back in New York, the War Department was negotiating with the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin because our reservation that we have now used to be ancestral Menominee land. And our first two stops in Wisconsin also were Ho-Chunk and Menominee land. So in 1822, we signed a treaty. And this treaty was where we moved to Kaukauna, Wisconsin, which is near the Fox River, and it's in the southern part of the state, not like too far south. It's probably an hour and a half from where I am right now. And many more people from New York joined us there in Kaukauna. We were English speaking, we could speak English. We have some firsts that happen in this area. We have Electa Quinney, who is the sister of one of our great diplomats, John Quinney. And I can tell you a little something exciting at the end of this that happened today in regards to John Quinney. But she was the first public school teacher in the area, which we kind of consider her the first public school teacher in Wisconsin, even though we were still part of Michigan Territory at that time. And she didn't just teach Native children, she taught all children. So we've got that. We also had the first Protestant minister when we arrived in the area. We had the first Christian temperance union also. And so there were a lot of firsts that happened. We set up a town. We, like created it out of nothing. We set up a mill and a school and stores, and we were doing really well. And we were adopting quote unquote white ways, but that didn't mean we weren't going to get moved again. That happens. So adopting the ways didn't prevent us from being moved again. The Fox River is actually a major waterway during that time, so they needed to get us out of the way. So the Stockbridge moved again, this time to the east shore of Lake Winnebago in 1834. And that's called Stockbridge, Wisconsin. And that is there again, we did the same thing that we did in Kaukauna. We set up a school and a town and a mill. And some of these structures still are like partially up. They're really, really old. And some of the land that we had there is now a cemetery where some of our ancestors have been buried that were there. And it was during this time in Stockbridge, Wisconsin, that a group of the Lenape or Munsee, also known as the Delaware, that were still in New York, came out and joined us. And that's when we became known as the Stockbridge Munsee Indians. So that's how our name evolved over the years. So we're a mixture of a lot of different tribes. We are first and foremost the Mohican Nation, but we're also Brotherton and Oneida and Pequot and Narragansett and Lenape as well. So that's really, we're kind of like we're our own little mixing pot. I'm not going to say melting pot because we do still hold on to our own cultures and traditions. But like the United States, we're a little mixing pot. I had a professor in college who anytime you called the United States a melting pot, he would just like lose his cool and say, no, we're not a melting pot. We're a salad, because you can see all the parts. You can see the lettuce and you can see the tomatoes and you can see the cucumbers. And that's kind of what we are. We haven't melted together. We're unique, which is really cool. And so I find myself throwing that example out a lot. And I'm like, oh gosh, I'm sounding like my professors now. So, but I just thought I'd give you that little example. So we were going to be moved again, because what did we do? We set up a nice little town and we set up all this fun stuff, but they're like, no, you need to move again. So finally, we get a home. The Treaty of 1856 establishes a reservation in Shawano County, which is where I am sitting right now. It encompasses 2 townships, the townships of Bartlemy and Red Springs in Shawano County. Forestry becomes the base of the economy. But that also brings in outsiders, and it brings in the lumber barons, who were very instrumental at clear cutting a lot of parts of the land. And we started to lose our land base, and that happens a lot of times when you're forced onto a reservation. So even though this land was part of us, it didn't stop it from people speculating and coming in and talking about and taking parts of the land. And so in 1871, we were forced into selling a lot of, we had to sell 54 sections of forested land in order to survive. And that was really difficult because we were losing our land base at that point. And that was something that was important to us. We also had a bit of a divide in the tribe happen as well. Until 1924, Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States, but some people thought if you could become citizens, you could have better benefits and things like that. So a lot of people like basically renounced their citizenship in the Stockbridge Munsee and became citizens of the United States. And then there were others who were like, no, we need to retain our sovereignty. We need to retain who we are. So you had a divide happen. You had the Indian Party versus the Citizen Party. And the Citizen Party actually, once they renounced citizenship or membership in the Stockbridge Munsee, actually left and they left the area. They sold their land, so they were selling parts of the reservation, and a lot of them left and went down to Kansas near Fort Leavenworth. And so we do have not too many areas of cultural significance down there, but there was a settlement that was down there. Eventually they came back and, we let them back into the tribe, but there was that divide that was happening. And because of that, there was a loss of land that was happening because in order to survive, a lot of people had to sell their land because they couldn't pay taxes on it. That's a whole thing that goes into the idea of allotment and the Dawes Act that was passed in 1877. And that's a whole other lecture in itself. It's very complicated to talk about, but so that happens. But then in 1934, we have something called the Indian Reorganization Act. It's also known as the Indian New Deal, as this was passed under the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And during the 1930s, as you know, we were in a depression, and we were trying to do things to get out of this depression. And so a lot of the alphabet acts and organizations were passed during that time. And one of these was the IRA. And the Indian commissioner at the time was a man by the name of John Collier. And what he does is he comes up with this act. Now, this act does a lot of different things. It defines the idea of the modern concept of blood quantum as we know it today. And blood quantum is very complicated, but at its core essence is it defines what being Indian means, and is a baseline that tribal nations use in order to determine tribal membership. You have to be X amount of blood, you have to be able to prove it. So it establishes the modern concept of blood quantum. It defines what it means to be a Native American. And when I say that, I mean, they literally sent out anthropologists to different Native groups, Native reservations across the country, and measured how big your nose was, how far apart your eyes were, what your hair looked like, were you the right color, so on and so forth. So there was a lot of information that happened that way. The other thing it did is it stopped the policy of allotment. And allotment was a policy, it's the general allotment policy, or the Dawes Act as it's known, that was passed in 1877 that took reservations and broke them up. And that took a toll on a lot of reservation land. And what it did is it stopped that policy. So it stopped the sale of unallotted land and put it back in the hands of the Native people. And so that happened a little bit with the Stockbridge Munsee, where we were able to get back some of the land that hadn't been sold. And that's where you get the checkerboard look on reservations. So if you go to Google Maps or whatever, and you look at the maps and you look at reservations, you notice they're not just big chunks of continuous pieces of land. They're kind of dotted. And the really good example that I love to use is actually the Oneida Reservation here in Wisconsin, in Green Bay. It's just a hot mess because you have one or two blocks, so to speak, that are reservation land, and then you have another part that's not. And it just goes back and forth like that. So that stops the policy of allotment. And some land was regained for the Stockbridge Munsee. Under the IRA, we regained 15,000 acres in the township of Bartlemy, and 2,500 acres of that land was placed into trust right away. And in 1972, the remaining 13,000 acres were placed in trust. Also, what the IRA did is it gave the ability for tribal nations to set up their own constitutions. So in 1937, the Stockbridge Munsee set up their constitution based on a model that the BIA put forth. And finally, for the first time for a lot of people, there was a land base that people had that they could build homes on. So that was also really important. Families began moving back into the area. The area that's right next door to my building used to be known as headquarters, because it was the headquarters of one of the lumber companies that was here. And so there were a lot of abandoned buildings. And once we regained the land back, families started to move back in, and they moved into those rough abandoned buildings and turned them into homes. By the end of 1937, like I said, we had a constitution that was written, and we had a place for people to come back home to. We had a tribal council that was elected, and our first president after the passage of the IRA was a man by the name of Harry Chicks. The second president that we had after the IRA, and our presidential terms are 2-year terms here, was a man by the name of Arvid E. Miller. And that's who this building that I'm in is named after. And he was tribal president for 26 years. So he was president through our whole reorganization. He was president during the time that the National Congress of the American Indian was founded. Great Lakes Intertribal Council was founded. He was instrumental in founding all of those things. And that is something that I think is really cool and really important to know. So who are the Stockbridge Munsee today? Today, we're the largest employer in Shawano County, whether that's through tribal employment or whether that is through casino employment. And we take that role very, very seriously. During the pandemic, yes, we've had a couple of shutdowns that have happened, particularly here in Wisconsin. We've turned into a hotspot, but our tribe takes its role as the largest employer very seriously and has put the safety of our citizens and employees first. And so they've been able to do really well. Our land base is approximately just over 24,000 acres. Some of that is in trust and some of that is fee land that's in the process of being put into trust. And the tribal enrollment is around 1,500 people, give or take a few. So we're a small tribe, but we're a mighty tribe. And this is just a photograph that my husband actually took of the river that runs through our reservation. And back there is a bridge. So it's very beautiful. And so now I just want to tell you a little bit about our cultural affairs department and what we do. And just as a note, all of these photos on this slide were taken last year, so before the pandemic. So I just want to point that out. So where I'm sitting is the Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum. And what's really special about this is if it was not for the wife of Arvid E. Miller, Bernice Miller, I wouldn't have a job. She was instrumental in starting the archives here at the Library Museum. And she started it with his papers. So all of his papers that he had throughout his tribe time as tribal president, serving on the National Congress of the American Indian, serving on Great Lakes Intertribal Council, all of that. And it really dates back to the 1930s when our people started traveling back east and going to cultural and educational institutions out east and looking for our history that was already there. And a lot of times, since the technology was not there, they were handwriting copies of, documents and important papers that are instrumental to our history. And so we have those here in our archives, and we have the largest Mohican archives in the world. And that is thanks to the diligent work of all of these people who came before me. And so a few years after Arvid passed away, actually, no, not even a few years. I think it was in the next year or the same year. The house that is actually on the other side of me, which was Bernice and Arvid's home, caught on fire. And all of his papers were in there. And so the community, obviously there was a fire, so the community came and, helped put the fire out. But one of the things that they did is they got all of his papers out of there. And so that was the start of the archives here at the Library Museum. We also have, we operate as a regular library. We can come check out books. We have lots of great books on Indigenous history, Indigenous policy and law, and children's books. We really love promoting children's reading programs and things like that. We also have a plethora of objects and items that are of cultural significance to the Stockbridge Munsee community. And like I said earlier, I was going to tell you something that's exciting that really exciting that happened today is through our historic preservation office. which is part of cultural affairs. We were able to repatriate an object of cultural significance earlier this year. That item actually came home today, which was really exciting. And so that's what our Historic Preservation Office does. That office, out of these 3 programs, is based out east. They were based in Troy, New York, but we recently just moved to Williamstown, Massachusetts, which is also part of our ancestral homelands. And the goal of the Historic Preservation Office is to preserve and protect our Mohican homelands and areas of cultural significance. And so we do that through Section 106 consultations on construction projects, cell phone towers, anything that's going to disturb an area of cultural significance. And then also through NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We are able to repatriate ancestors who are just sitting on museum shelves, and we're able to give them proper burial and put them back into the ground. And in the case of today, we're able to repatriate items of cultural significance. So we brought home John Quinney's powder horn. And John Quinney was one of our leaders. He was instrumental in protection of our lands in New York and the move here to Wisconsin. He died in 1855. But his powder horn is something that we now have in our collection. And we were able to do that through NAGPRA, proving it was an item of cultural patrimony, meaning that it extended just beyond belonging to him. It became a community item when he became our leader. And that's what we argued. And so we had a very COVID safe, super small ceremony today. And it was really great to be able to bring that item back home. And then we also we have our language revitalization program. And we are unique in the fact that we have 2 official languages here in the Stockbridge Munsee community. We have our Munsee language, which was first really hardcore revitalized in the 1970s. We're lucky enough that there are still fluent Munsee speakers alive. A lot of our community members went to Canada, to Moraviantown, and learned the language there and then brought it back here. The second part is in the last couple of years, we've been working on our Mohican revitalization, and that's been a little bit more harder and a little bit more taxing to do because there are no fluent speakers of the Mohican language anywhere in the United States or North America. So through a grant, we were able to work with a linguist out of Canada who works with other Indigenous languages. And through documentation that we had, through catechisms that we had that were written in the Mohican language, through just the written word, we were able to wake this language back up and try to figure out what it might have sounded like through the writings of Mohican leaders who might have written Mohican words, through talking with current community members in the community, saying, hey, do you remember when you were younger? Were there any words that you remember? Things like that. And we were able to bring this language alive. And we offer now Mohican language classes every week, in addition to our Munsee language classes. So it's really exciting to be part of this work and to see everything come full circle, from being forced off of our homelands in the East to finally finding a home here in Wisconsin, and bringing our culture and history awareness back to the community. It's really exciting, and I'm very excited to be part of it. And I'm very excited to have told you just a little bit about the Stockbridge Munsee history in the area that you're at, but in general. I mean, we're a small tribe, but we're a mighty tribe, and we are definitely not the last of the Mohicans. And so I want to thank the Hudson Area Library for allowing me to speak to you tonight. And I am open to any questions that you have. I'm an educator and a historian by trade, so there's not a question that you can ask me that I'm going to be offended by, because I'd rather you ask it and know the answer instead of leaving here thinking that you know it and you don't. And if I don't know something, a professor always told me it's okay to say you don't know. So again, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to a great Q&A session.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. So I've written in the chat that anybody can ask questions. I think with so many people on, we've had up to 90 people, that we need to put questions in the chat rather than, say it through audio. So I have the first question for you already, Heather. So everybody can feel free to put your questions in chat. This person is curious to know, as someone who lives and owns a business on the land that used to be inhabited by the Mohicans, is there a way that we can give back, support the Stockbridge Munsee community as a form of reparations? Great question.
That is a great question, and I will shamelessly plug, if you go to Mohican.com and go to our cultural affairs tab, so you're going to go to the website, look at departments, click on our cultural affairs tab. We have donation links for our library and museum, historic preservation, and language revitalization. And you can click on any of those and give a monetary donation if you're able to. If you are not able to, one way that you can acknowledge the Stockbridge Munsee is create a land acknowledgement and have it in your place of business or in your cultural or educational institution. It's something that's very simple that can be done. We actually have one that's written for our department. So if you need it or you want to discuss it, by all means, shoot me an email. But it's something super simple that can be done. And even though like, oh, you're just acknowledging the land, that goes that's huge. That goes a long way in making sure that the Stockbridge Munsee history and legacy still lives on.
Wonderful. And I see our library director just put the link that you suggested, and I'm going to put in your email if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
You did offer, so
yes.
Give that to everyone. And so thank you for that. And our next question is, what changes do you hope for with the Biden administration? So I think we're thinking about that a lot, and it's nice to hear this in relation to a very specific topic, so, and people.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping, oh gosh, where do I even start? Well, I think 2020 proved that the power of the Native vote can sway an election. We've had states turn blue that haven't turned blue in decades. Arizona being a really good example. If you look at the voting population, if you break it down, I'm a political scientist nerd as well. One of my degrees is in political science. And so, of course, I have to analyze the maps and everything. And if you break that down, the areas that went blue hardcore, were the reservations. And so I think I think we're standing up and we're saying, hey, enough's enough. I think one of the smallest things is it's November and it's Native American Heritage Month. And there hasn't been an acknowledgement by the current administration for Native American Heritage Month in 4 years. So I think something just as simple as that. I think I'm hoping that the new administration brings back the tribal summits between tribal nations and the White House. I hope the new administration puts up, a good plan towards tribal policies and tribal nations on their website. There's no mention of Native nations on the current White House website. I hope there is an acknowledgement that the land is important and the land is sacred and the land is not there for you to drill on, like there has been made through the current administration. And I hope protections that were rolled back on certain land areas, specifically out west with Bears Ears and all the sacred sites out there, I hope those protections are put back on. So, the new administration, they've got a lot. And I know I just read an article just today that possibly we could have a Native woman running the Department of the Interior, and that would be freaking awesome. So I really hope that the Biden-Harris administration does a lot, and I think they will.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
So Megan is asking, do you know how many Native people originally lived in Hudson, New York? And are you familiar with the area as far east? Is it east? Oh, wait. Yeah, no, west. East, I don't know. Yeah, west of Stockbridge into New York. So we're a river town right by Hudson.
Yeah, so I don't know population numbers off the top of my head for that particular area, but I can tell you, prior to the arrival of Columbus in the North American continent, there were over 10 million Native people across the continent.
Okay, wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And to Megan, I'll just say, if you want to pursue this, particularly in relation to Hudson, you can go to our website, hudsonarealibrary.org, to the history room page, and you can actually fill out an online research request that we will take, and our volunteer researchers will definitely look into that. I don't know the answer, but I have a feeling a couple of them who are on tonight may have some information. And Joseph is asking, are there any historic Munsee sites in New York and Massachusetts that are open to the public? I know you mentioned the Mission House, that it was still there. So are there any open to the public?
So the Mission House is a museum now too. It currently, because of the pandemic, is not open to the public right now. So that's what you're going to encounter, is there's a lot of these sites that are just not open right now because they are in museums or anything like that. As far as sites of cultural significance, we don't really broadcast them because we want, not saying that any of you, but we don't want people to go there and dig around and dig things up. We just want things to be left. So you could be walking by a culturally significant site, just, going on your evening walk and not even know it. So that whole area we definitely consider significant, but there are others in the area. I know, like there's a really great Pequot museum just over in Connecticut. I'm not sure if they're open right now or not. But I do know that, for example, like the Mission House, it's just not open. We're actually working at an exhibit for the Mission House that we're hoping to open in next summer, and we're also working on an exhibit for the Berkshire Museum in Massachusetts that we're hoping to have next summer as well. So it's just a matter. The pandemic has just put a hamper on everything. So any places that I could tell you to go to are not open right now.
And do you have a newsletter that people can sign up to? Because I was thinking we can sign up to it and then put some of that information on our social media.
Yeah, we're in the process of trying to develop one.
Okay, so we'll stay in touch. And then
yes, we will stay in touch. And once we have it up and running, we will send you the information and people can sign up to receive it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So someone's asking a bit of a similar question from before, but is there a way for people out east to donate or give land back to the Stockbridge Munsee community? That's an interesting question.
That's an interesting question, and you wish it could just be a simple yes, but it's a complicated no. It's because we are considered a sovereign nation. It's not just like a business entity buying land back. There's a whole process that we have to go through the Department of the Interior and being recognized as sovereign nations. That is just it's just too, like, you can't just like give it back. However, we do have relationships with different organizations out east, one of them being Soulfire Farm in New York, where they are located on ancestral Mohican land, and it's a great farm. It's a great organization. I recommend that you look them up on your social media, Soulfire Farm. And what we did is we entered into an agreement with them, and they created a cultural easement. And so we're able to use that space for cultural ceremony, gatherings, and things like that. And so we have, it went through our legal department, went through their legal department. And so we have that. So it's not like, we're gaining, it's not like we own that. We're able to use it. And so we have entered into agreements such as that for cultural easements. But the idea of just like giving land back it's more complicated than that.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tina would like to know, when the people were relocated, was there any compensation given for the towns and mills and homes that were left behind?
So like yes and no. When you enter into treaties, there's usually some sort of compensation that's put in those treaties. Whether that happens is a whole other story. treaties are legal binding contracts that are entered into by sovereign entities. And so like I like my example that I love to use the most is the most famous treaty is the Treaty of Paris, which granted the United States independence from Great Britain. And that's a treaty that even though that was written in the 1700s, we still honor today. And so treaties between native nations, though, in the United States are a bit more complicated and they're not always honored. So while you might have something written in about annuities or compensation being paid, sometimes that doesn't always happen.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
There's a question about a Thanksgiving play that you are doing in Lenox and a tour of Stockbridge. So
the Thanksgiving play through Wham Theater. Is that what the person is talking about?
WAM?
Yeah, Wham Theater. Okay, yeah. So there is Wham Theater is putting on a play called Thanksgiving Play. It's written by a Lakota playwright, Larissa Fasthorse, and it is a satirical piece of work about Thanksgiving, and it involves. I've seen some clips of it. It's kind of funny. It involves like 4 white people trying to like do Thanksgiving and like honoring Native people. It's hard to explain, but I recommend that you watch it and you can actually start viewing it. Today's Thursday, so you can start viewing it. If you go to their website, you can purchase your tickets and you can view it via online. They reached out to us. Wham Theater reached out to us when they were first putting it together. Because they are located on ancestral territory, and said, how can we work together? And so what I did is I actually recorded a video land acknowledgement ahead of it. So you'll see that before you see the play. And then they also are giving out resources and ways you can be involved and donate to our museum. So yeah, I actually did a panel on that play yesterday, and I've got my ticket and I'm ready. I'm so excited to view it this evening and later on tomorrow. So yes, if you can check it out, please visit Wham Theater, register, get your ticket, and you should be in for a really good show.
Sounds wonderful. And Alan is asking, is it Mohican or Mahican, M-A-H, instead of M-O-H? Is there a difference, a nuance?
It's either or. Mohican would probably be the most traditional because it refers to the Mahicanatuk. So, and the Mahicanatuk, we spell M-A. And so M-O is kind of a more European, Euro version of it. So M-A would be more traditional, and more traditional from that would be the Mohicanu. So it goes from there. But if you want to be more observant, I would do the M-A instead of the M-O.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Michael would like to hear more about land acknowledgement. And for me, it's new from about a couple months ago. And I see people sometimes even put land acknowledgement in with their signatures just as a matter of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so land acknowledgements are something that are super simple that you can do. If you're looking at a way of, honoring, you can do it, something, you can do it like tomorrow. And so I actually did a museum conference earlier this year, a virtual museum conference, and I talked about that. I did a panel and talked about land acknowledgement. So I can just really quickly, there's a few steps that I like to give you when you're doing a land acknowledgement. The first step is don't assume you know whose land you are on. Don't assume it, because 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be wrong. You need to research the land that you're on and understand that you could be sitting on more than one tribe's ancestral land. A lot of areas were considered like hubs for people to travel and stop in. So the good example I like to use is Chicago. Chicago, you had the Menominee, you had the Kickapoo, you had the Miami, you had the Ottawa, you had the Potawatomi. So you have 5 right there. There's more, but 5 that I just listed off right there. So you want to not assume and research whose land you're on. You also then want to reach out to that tribal nation that you're going to honor. Maybe they have a land acknowledgement already written. Maybe they want to be involved in that process of writing the land acknowledgement. And it's always good to, reach out to them anyways. The second thing, or the next thing you want to do after that is you want to acknowledge the past, but you want to acknowledge that contemporary as well. Because a lot of tribal nations, we have migration stories because we were forced out of our homelands. So I mean, clearly I'm not sitting on the east part of the United States with you guys. I'm here in the Midwest because my people were forced to move out of there. So you want to acknowledge that the ancestral land that you are on, so Stockbridge Munsee Mohican land, and then you want to acknowledge the contemporary. So we're not there right now. You're acknowledging that you're on the ancestral land, but you're acknowledging that currently we're in Wisconsin and we're known as the Stockbridge Munsee Community. We're still here. And then the last thing you want to do is you want to include an action item in that acknowledgement. So, because words are just words. An acknowledgement doesn't mean jack if there's not action attached to it. So for our land acknowledgement that we have for our community that we wrote, and was approved by our tribal council, is our action item is creating an inclusive and equitable space for all. That's what you want to do. You don't have to put that as your action item, but that's an example as to what an action item could be. So a lot of times ours is used in a lot of educational institutions, libraries, colleges, universities. And so that's that space. So you want to have that action item. So don't assume, research, reach out to that tribal nation, acknowledge the contemporary, and add an action item.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jens writes, pandemics are on our mind, and I'm aware of how the native populations of the Americas were reduced by up to 90%. Do you have information about how early and how severely the Mohican people were affected?
By the current pandemic?
I take it to mean the historic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the big diseases that was out there was smallpox, and smallpox just virtually wiped out people. We were hit pretty early on because we were colonized very early on. I mean, 1609, we met Henry Hudson. So from then on, disease would just run rampant. Not saying it didn't wipe us out completely, but there were some nations that don't exist anymore. And I don't have numbers per se on, I have numbers written down somewhere, not off the top of my head, but and I can get you that information, but I don't believe that the Mohicans, they were hit hard, but not to the point of extinction.
Okay, and we can send that on to the people that are in the Zoom tonight.
Yeah. I have that information somewhere. It's probably in another folder.
And then, who is this? John wants to know, are there any members of the tribe in Oneida, New York currently?
I don't believe so. I don't know off the top of my head though. Again, some people did stay behind every time there was a move. Just like you have Cherokee Nation, but then you have the Eastern Band of Cherokee still in North Carolina. So you have Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, you have the Eastern Band of Cherokee still in North Carolina. So just as, with every nation that moved, people always stayed behind. So I would assume that people of Mohican-Munsee did stay behind in our Eastern homelands, but I wouldn't have an accurate number for you.
Okay. And Anika would like to know if there are books or reference material available dedicated to the Stockbridge Munsee tradition and lore. So just to repeat from the introduction, we do have several books that are specific to the Stockbridge Munsee that I believe our library director, Emily Shamidas, actually was referred to from your website. So, so you can answer the question, but they are in our system and you can check them out, anyone who's local.
Yes, absolutely. And if you so love that book so much and care to purchase from a tribal nation, we carry them here in our gift shop and we do ship.
Yes, you do. I believe you do because we received them from you.
Oh, there you go. So, yep, there you go. Wonderful. Yeah, but every book that you recommended would be a book that I would answer that question with.
Okay, and for anybody who joined after the introduction again, I am sending out that book list, and I will mark on that book list what books you can purchase from the organization. So Amanda would like to know, how often are Mohican ancestral objects able to be repatriated? Are efforts to repatriate specific items always ongoing?
So repatriation can be a process that can either go really fast or it can take a really long time. In the case of the powder horn that we brought home today, we did that repatriation this year. So we, gave our intent to repatriate in February. When I returned that object was on loan here. And so when I returned it back to the Oshkosh Public Museum here in Wisconsin, I returned it giving them our intention, and they were like, yep, cool. We sent our official letter of repatriation in March. And then there's a waiting process that you have to go through due to the NAGPRA laws. And that process ended in October, and it just came home today. So that went really fast in most cases, because there's a process where their museum board votes on it, on whether or not they want to repatriate it. Sometimes they have more questions for us because unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I think this is where the law gets it wrong, the burden of proof is put on us. And I feel like that needs to really be on the institution itself holding the item, but that's a whole other story. But sometimes they have more questions for us, but we were able to answer the questions right away. And so again, like we brought that item home today. That happened very quickly. There have been other repatriations that happened that have taken decades. So it all depends. And we currently submitted another letter of intent to repatriate another couple items, and we'll see how that repatriation goes. They don't always go as smoothly as this one did with the powder horn. And they don't always go as quickly. So it depends. It depends on what the object is. It depends on the institution's willingness to even want to work with us. I mean, they have the ability to make things difficult if they want. We're going on the good nature of people and hoping that they don't. And so it really just depends. So I'm hoping, because this one went so smoothly, the next one goes smoothly. But we have like a list. We made like our wish list of things that we want to get back that belong to our community. And some of those things are at the Smithsonian as well. And that is a whole other process in itself, because the Smithsonian follows a whole other set of rules. So it's a lot. That's going to be the beast to tackle. So we're hoping to tackle these smaller institutions first, and then move on to the big one later on.
Thank you. Our library director put up the Facebook page for the Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum in the
Wonderful.
And we'll send that on as well to everyone. Jeffrey would like you to know that the Ramapo Lenape Nation is here in the Hillburn, Maua, I'm saying that wrong, Ringwood area, of which myself and my wife Cynthia are a part of. My wife is also Penobscot from Maine. So welcome.
Welcome, yeah.
Sarah sent us a donation link for a Soul Fire Farm, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, and that's in the chat box, and we can add that link also to your list. Give me 1 second. Peggy would like to know, please repeat for me about the prelude to a reservation. Oh, right. So you did, the precursor to the reservation were the praying towns?
The praying towns, yes.
That was set up in Stockbridge. Were they owned?
They were basically mission towns that were set up to convert Native Americans. And so they would eventually lead to the reservation system. It was just basically an area where everyone gathered. So yeah, that was the precursor to the reservations, which would happen later on in the 1800s.
Okay. And Samantha writes, it sounds like movements around land return and reparations are going to face plenty of bureaucracy and will have to rely more immediately on creative and cultural solutions like the easement established with Soulfire. Are the Stockbridge Munsee or other tribes currently engaged in any specific political actions that would attempt to remove some of these bureaucratic obstacles? And are there ways to support these actions? Great question.
Not to my knowledge, specifically for Stockbridge Munsee, but in general, there is a huge movement happening right now called the Land Back Movement. And it was actually launched this year on Indigenous Peoples Day. And it revolves around the returning of the Black Hills to the Lakota. And that's been a case that has been going on forever. Since 1874, when there was gold discovered in the Black Hills, and by a man named George Armstrong Custer. And so he met his demise later on. But the Land Back movement really gained, it really started out of protests that happened when the leader of the current administration wanted to do a 4th of July rally in the middle of a pandemic in the Black Hills at Mount Rushmore. And so what the land protectors that were able to do is they blocked traffic on the road up to Mount Rushmore for 3 hours. And if you've ever been on that road, there's like one road in and one road out. And so they were able to block traffic for 3 hours. And a lot of them were arrested for just being on their land. And so out of that was born the Land Back movement. And you can learn more about that at landback.org. And it's through one of the sponsors is the NDN collection. And what their goals are is to, as it stands, have land returned back. One of those is having the Black Hills returned back to the Lakota and having Mount Rushmore shut down. Because if you stop and really think about it, it's a symbol of white supremacy in the middle of a sacred spot. The Lakota believe the Black Hills is where the Great Spirit resides. And so basically as a church, that's your church. That's where you go to worship and pray and be in the Creator's presence. And so having a symbol like Mount Rushmore for presidents who were not the greatest towards Native Americans, who were not the greatest towards, 2 of them were slave owning. The third, he freed the slaves, but he also signed the death warrant for 38 Dakota warriors who were just trying to feed their families. And Teddy Roosevelt said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. So to have that symbol in such a sacred place is it's scary and it's not good. It's very sad. And so Land Back is about returning land back, including land in national parks, because a lot of the national parks were carved out of ancestral native land. So if you want to learn more about that, again, you can visit landback.org. Stockbridge Munsee, there's nothing that I'm aware of that's going on at the moment.
Thank you. And Carrie would like to know, could you talk about the relationship between the Mohicans and the Dutch settlers in the Hudson Valley? What is the Stockbridge Munsee perspective of this relationship? And is there further reading on the topic?
So further reading could be in any of those books that were first talked about at the beginning. I would encourage you to purchase or check them out at your local library. The relationship between any Native group and a settler group is often complicated because you are seeing this invading force coming in. So whether it's the Dutch, the French, or the British, doesn't matter who, it's a force that's coming into your space. And you do things, you try to form relationships, not because you're trying to be nice. You form relationships and alliances because you're trying to survive. So any relationship between a Native nation and a settler group is about survival. And so that's what those relationships are all about. They might have been pleasant and helpful, but in the end, it's about protecting your land and your people.
Good. Thank you. And again, we're getting another question saying, how can people specifically, this will be the last question. We had a lot of questions. We have a lot of homework, which is exciting. A lot of resources that we'll be sending everyone. But
Yeah.
someone would like to know specific to what can Hudson Valley residents do specifically for the Stockbridge Munsee community? So I don't know if there's anything more particular in relation to that.
Yeah, that's such a broad question, so I'm not really sure how to answer that. What I would do, what I would suggest is you can encourage your educational or cultural institutions in that area to offer more presentations like this, or to offer land acknowledgements, offer resources, and things like that. That's what I would recommend in that. And then trying, like, it's hard because it's such a broad thing to do. And the only thing I can really say is, just to ask for more of that history. And we're more than happy to provide local institutions such as the Hudson Area Library with more resources that they can provide out to the residents in the area. And because we want to make sure people know that the Stockbridge Munsee were there, and that we're still around, and we're here. And we have such a vested interest in that area. It calls to us. It's our home. Our ancestors lived, loved, and died there. And, so that's part of us. We feel that. And so, I'm hoping in the future, we're working on building a cultural center here. I'm hoping in the future, maybe we can have smaller satellite cultural centers in our homelands. So that would be something really cool. And gosh, I think, I don't really know what else to say.
Well, no, I think that was very well said. And thank you so much, Heather. This was a wonderful talk. We're now getting thank yous for the talk,
Wonderful.
positive feedback. And as I said, we have lots of exciting, I don't want to call it homework because some people have, PTSD still from childhood, but we're getting lots of exciting information that I will send on to people. And thank you again so much. This is such an important topic, and we're so glad to learn more about Native people in our area. And thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.